My arguments against evolution are, number one, it's dead in the water because there are things you, by definition, cannot build step by tiny step as Darwin has demanded. And secondly, we have a full-fledged counter-explanation that's scientifically superior. And this is what the courts have demanded. This is really a bombshell. It's sort of a quiet bombshell because it's in the background and tends not to occupy a lot of the press. But if you are online fighting with atheists or you're engaging in some sort of apologetic debate, this is the last resort. That's, to me, one of the strongest arguments then against evolution. It's not just that it's wrong, but we've come up with something superior, and this idea is working, and this is poised to change the culture.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon Sense in Current Times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm excited to be here with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He holds the PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University, where he studied adult stem cells and published several peer-reviewed papers. He is formerly with the Institute for Creation Research. He now serves as a research biologist and author and speaker in Answers in Genesis. Dr. Jeanson, he specializes in using DNA comparisons to explore the origins of species and human history, and is the author of multiple books, including Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species in 2017, and Replacing Darwin Made Simple that he published in 2023. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much for having me on, Peter.
So, just real quick, how would you describe the difference between Replacing Darwin and Replacing Darwin Made Simple of those two books you have? How would you explain the difference there?
One is the technical version, though I had a pastor read through it. So Replacing Darwin with the blue butterfly on the front is one that gives the thorough justification. I did try to make the main text accessible to the layperson, but it is heavy reading. And Replacing Darwin Made Simple is the Cliff Notes version. Replacing Darwin, I would say my primary audience is probably unbelievers, though I like to split the difference and make it understandable to all. But I'm assuming that the audience doesn't know anything about creation science, doesn't necessarily agree with it, and they tend to know what the evolutionists are going to say in opposition to what I'm claiming. Whereas in Replacing Darwin Made Simple, first part is how does species form, and I explicitly call out believers in the opening part. And then part two is, okay, let's say you're a grandparent, a parent, child comes home, grandchild comes home, I don't believe the Bible anymore, I believe in evolution, that sort of thing. How do you engage them? And so it's step by step. Here's what they're likely going to say are the reasons why they reject the Bible, reject Genesis, accept evolution. And then here's how you would use the information you just learned to counter that.
What is your number one objection to evolution that science, because science is, Darwinism is not rooted in science. I mean, it really is not. So what is your number one objection when you look at it, when you look at the answer to when someone comes home and says, hey, I don't believe in creationism anymore?
Number one, that's a good question. I think I'd have to come up with about 3 objections. Tough to pick just one. Maybe because I've been in this so long and I already know kind of the back and forth of what my opponents would say to counter what I'm saying. In terms of what stops evolution dead in its tracks, Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, I would say is one of the most airtight cases against evolution. Came out in, I think, 1995 or 1996, and no evolutionist has been able to answer it for however many decades that's been. Using Darwin's own words, or using Darwin's own test for evolution, applying it to modern molecular biology and biochemistry and saying, are there structures in nature that evolution cannot build, naturalistic evolution cannot build step by step, and he identifies all sorts of them. And at the simplest example, I'd say, that I think works for a lay audience would be simply, let's say, sexual reproduction. You have to have male and female. We can explain this now in molecular terms where you have to have specific decorations at the molecular level, molecules on sperm that have to line up lock and key with the egg. But you don't even need to know that. We have to have male and female. So how do you evolve that step by tiny step? That's what Darwin says has to happen for evolution to occur, step by tiny step, or it's a wash. In other words, evolution cannot invoke massive changes that sound very much like miracles. It has to be these small gradual changes. And those are abundant, these sorts of counterexamples of structures that require, and here's really the definition that Behe used. His term was irreducible complexity, but it's essentially multiple interacting components, mutually interdependent components, where you have to have all pieces in place for the system to work, for natural selection to work on it, basically, for evolution to happen, or the system falls apart. You can't build this one piece at a time, because one piece does nothing. There's no functional purpose. So life is full of these sorts of irreducibly complex structures, systems. You cannot build it. That, though, has been a insufficient standard. So here's my, the little voice on the shoulder that would talk to me. If you look at the legal debate over the last 40 years, the courts would say, my opponents would say, that's insufficient to introduce creation science into the public schools. That's not, just pointing out flaws is not sufficient evidence to remove evolution. Though we all recognize that it's dead in the water. They would say you have to come up with, or creation science, or intelligent design, whichever counter explanation there that exists. We would have to come up with some sort of testable predictions to counter what this is saying. And so that may be a complicated technical scientific concept. It's really simple to understand. Favorite example I like to use is, if someone doesn't know me from Adam, they probably see me, maybe they see my bio, they might assume that I'm a nerd. That'd be a good guess. That'd be a good hypothesis. You can test that hypothesis. It makes predictions. Nerds tend to have, let's say, less than modern sense of fashion. And so one prediction of the hypothesis that Jeanson is a nerd is that I'm going to dress like I'm living in an era 20 years ago or so. And I do wear pants that are 15 years old still, so that hypothesis would be confirmed if anyone tried to look through my wardrobe. That's the same type of thing that applies to hardcore science. If we say God created 6,000 years ago, if we say that Noah and his family restarted the entire human race basically 4,500 years ago after the flood, that should make predictions we can test in the lab or in the field. Not with fashion sense, of course, but that's what they've demanded. And so my book, Replacing Darwin, specifically, the title specifically chosen with that 40-year legal history in mind, is designed to counter specifically that argument. So in short, then, I'd say my arguments against evolution are, number one, it's dead in the water because there are things you, by definition, cannot build step by tiny step as Darwin has demanded. And secondly, we have a full-fledged counter-explanation that's scientifically superior. And this is what the courts have demanded. This is really a bombshell. It's sort of a quiet bombshell because it's in the background and tends not to occupy a lot of the press. But if you are online fighting with atheists or you're engaging in some sort of apologetic debate, this is the last resort. This is what the courts have fallen back on for so long, saying, well, you guys don't do science, is their counter-argument. So what if we found flaws with evolution? You can't give us something better. And my answer is, no, we have. And I've been specifically working in the realm of genetics to develop these testable predictions, and I've seen these predictions come true. That's, to me, one of the strongest arguments then against evolution. It's not just that it's wrong, but we've come up with something superior, and this idea is working, and this is poised to change the culture.
So, when you raise this, one of the things that I think where Darwin fails too is there's obviously he doesn't address or deal with the origin of life itself, where life began. It starts with this idea that everything's going to be kind of mutated or changed, survival of the fittest, natural selection, all of this. But it doesn't deal with origin of life. Yet it still seems that now science, through the fine-tuning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the earth, there's so many different scientific explanations that are more valued and more provable. Even atheists are admitting now that there is a creator, or at least a creation, a beginning of time. So as a result of that, how is it that that's not going into effect across in our schools? I mean, you're right. We want to, even if we say, look, okay, we're going to look at the two different science methods. Here is the idea of where life began on one side, and Darwin doesn't really address that. He just kind of addresses how we kind of mutated to where we are now. Why do you think that's the case? If the courts are now looking at science and needing that, the overwhelming scientific evidence speaks against Darwinism and speaks in favor of a creation.
Yes, I just discovered a historical answer for this. this is, of course, the 100th year anniversary of the Scopes trial. And I made a discovery about a week ago. We're having an article come out in the next couple of weeks. I think it's on the 21st of July, closing arguments anniversary for the Scopes trial. But what I discovered is there was a historical trajectory started at the Scopes trial, closed about the 1960s, and we're in the second phase of this historical cycle that relates directly to your question. So this may sound like it's coming out of right field, but it'll hit directly why they've basically made illegal us being allowed to talk about those sorts of problems in the public schools. So I had to step back. So again, this is a bit of background, but it'll make sense here in a minute. I think that the finish is really explosive and bodes well. It's really a good omen, I think, for creation science as a whole and arguments against evolution. Scopes trial. So of course, this story starts with the Butler Act, 1925 March. The state of Tennessee forbids the teaching of evolution. And the evolutionists, you'd think, if they're so against this, would try to first immediately repeal the Butler Act, which they didn't for 40 years. Why is that? I think the answer is because public opinion was against them. So they tried to change public opinion. And the way they did it at the Scopes trial was to openly mock William Jennings Bryan and the law itself. Mockery was step one of their process to try to eventually push back against the gains of creationists. So they technically lost the trial because the guy was convicted of teaching evolution, but they won this victory of mocking. And historians would say creationists pulled back from the public arena. Some became theistic evolutionists. It really was an effective blow in sort of halting the momentum that had just gotten going. Over the next 40 years then, what the evolutionists did was to chip away at the legal foundation. So 1947, you have the Establishment Clause logic applied to state law, not just federal law. And of course, the Tennessee law is a state law, not a federal one. And I think at 62, prayer is removed from school, so that the whole relationship between church and state and religion in the schools is being eroded. And the language of the Butler Act is explicitly religious. Anything that contradicts, I think it says, the teaching of divine creation. This isn't just we're going to pick on evolution. It's we're going to specifically say essentially for teaching against the Bible. So then, in 68, an Arkansas anti-evolutionary law was repealed. 67, the Tennessee Butler Act was finally repealed. Maybe they saw the writing on the wall, and you think that'd be the end of the story. So it's basically mock them is the evolutionist strategy, mock them to halt the strategy, repeal the legal foundation, and then strike the final blow. Well, 61, several years prior, is the start of a new cycle. Morrison Whitcomb published The Genesis Flood. I think historians, evolutionists, and creationists alike would say that's the start of the modern young earth creationist revival. The 1970s are a real heyday of creation science. I was born 1980, so I never saw it personally, but I've read about it, where they're doing debates in college campuses. There's thousands of students coming out, lots of enthusiasm. They're introducing creation science, equal time measures in the public schools. What really clicked for me, though, in terms of how this relates to the anti-evolutionary stuff, the 1970s and some of what you're referring to about the scientific deficiencies in the evolutionary explanation for the origin of life, that is essentially, it's respectful, but it's public mockery. Because it's embarrassing for evolution that it's so full of holes. And so what the courts have eventually have ultimately decided, and what the evolutionists have chosen then as a battle strategy, was to make mockery illegal. They employed it, of course, in the Scopes trial because it worked. And once creationists basically, I don't know if they consciously thought about this way, but when Morrison Gish, for example, would stand up and say, evolution doesn't fit the fossil record, it doesn't fit the origin of life, it doesn't fit thermodynamics, and boom, 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 it's a strong anti-evolutionary argument. The evolutionists admit they were very successful. They won't necessarily admit that the arguments were correct. They'll just say they were good at what they did in debating evolutionists and pointing out these flaws, and so they reacted. They pulled back from debates. You really can't find hardly anyone who will debate a creation scientist today. So that was effective in stopping some evolutionary momentum. We've, in a sense, technically lost the court cases because the equal time measures were repealed in the 1980s. So that's why you can't even put a sticker, I think, in Cobb County, Georgia, saying there's problems with evolution. No, mockery is forbidden. That's their conclusion. But what we've been able to do over the past 40 years is progressively erode the legal foundation, not by restoring religious language into schooling, but if you look at the text of the court decisions, why they say we can't even put a sticker on evolutionary textbooks saying, hey, there's questions about this, and there's legitimate scientific concerns. You think that'd be pretty innocuous. They say no, you have to make testable predictions. Well, we've been doing that, and really in the last 10 years, this has accelerated dramatically, so that now creation scientists are making discoveries. And here's, I think, that this really represents a big evolutionary gamble. They've said, in reaction to the successes of creation science, and I'm thinking of a book that I had growing up, I think it was published early 80s, The Mystery of Life's Origin, pointing out what you just referred to, the probabilistic impossibility, statistical impossibility of the origin of life, evolutionarily speaking. Why can't we learn about that in school? Why can't students learn about that in public schools? The courts have said, you can't mock. They basically said, we're not going to repeat scopes for creation science. You can't mock this anymore. You have to come up with testable predictions of your own. That's a gamble, because I think they assumed creation scientists would never be able to meet that standard. And they've made it very difficult, of course. We can't get any of the $45 billion annually that the NIH gets for research funds. But we've been able to make progress. We've made predictions. We've seen them fulfilled. And we're now making discoveries in arenas that the public has interest in. And so I think this gamble is eventually going to backfire on the evolutionists. What I'm saying is, if you look at the Scopes trial, they start with mockery, then they erode the legal foundation, then they win. We've mocked evolution. We've pointed out the scientific flaws of evolution for many years. In a sense, we've lost the legal decision, but we've been eroding the legal basis for it, step 2 of this progress, this cycle for the past 40 years. And it suggests then we're on the cusp of finally putting the nail in the coffin and either being able to remove evolution from the public schools again or put creation science back in. So I agree, that's a long-winded, yes, I agree that there's major scientific problems with the origin of life, and again, you can list all sorts of other ones with evolution. The reason I think we're not allowed in is because the evolutionists realized what was going on. It was too good of a tool to counteract evolution, so they said, yeah, we're going to make it illegal. You can't talk about problems of evolution. That's too much mockery. We can't stand that. And they've erected a different standard for creation science, but we've been meeting that standard, and I think the way history is progressing, we could be on the cusp of finally seeing this brick wall broken through.
Did you know that sitting all day can significantly impact blood circulation? I mean, look up, there's a ton of research on it. Your leg and calf muscles help pump blood back to your heart. So when you sit, blood pools in your legs. And further studies show that sitting decreases nitric oxide production, making vessels less able to expand. This is why, like in the afternoons, or if you've been sitting for a long time, you start noticing low energy, brain fog, or just kind of feeling a step slower. It might be creeping in on you after a while. And a lot of that could be linked to your circulation. So Juvedon has created Blood Flow 7. It is designed to support healthy nitric oxide levels, which helps your blood vessels relax, open up, improving oxygen and nutrient delivery to your brain, heart, and muscles. That means better stamina, mental clarity, and overall vitality without caffeine or stimulants. It's made with clinically studied natural ingredients, and in research, these have been shown to boost nitric oxide by as much as 230% in just a few hours. It helps open arteries for smoother blood flow. So there's just 2 easy capsules a day. There's no mess, no fuss, and you're supporting your heart health, your healthy blood pressure, and more energy to power through the day. So check it out at bloodflow7, that's the number 7.com/uncommon, or you can click the link in the description. That's bloodflow number 7, so bloodflow7.com/uncommon. It is just common sense. My daughter's when she was in college, she just graduated recently. Her first day of a biology class, they said, use the scientific method to prove that God doesn't exist. And she called me and she's like, I know the scientific method proves that there is a God. So how do I answer it? And I said, well, I said, you can either fail here or you could fail up there. The choice is yours. And, and they didn't even grade that question. However, later, the same professor said, you never see a doctor that doesn't believe in evolution. He's like, because they can't treat the flu because the flu's mutation of cells proves evolution. How do you respond to that? Like, because in dealing with genetics and dealing with all of these, molecular issues that you're dealing with, that on the surface that seems like a good argument. How do you respond to that?
I have a couple different responses. If you look at the surveys, And this is what struck me as pretty wild, like Pew Forum surveys. They've done one, I think it was 2015, on the members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, biggest scientific organization, I think, of professional scientists in the United States. And 99% of PhDs hold to evolution. That's one statistical outcome of their survey. I think that's likely valid. But what also struck me, maybe in the same survey or a related one, is they surveyed religious views among scientists. And about 2/3 of professional scientists cannot even acknowledge the existence of a God of some sort, let alone the Christian God. Some of them are outright atheist. Some of them say some sort of vague, yeah, there might be a higher power. But there was an extremely strong anti-religious sentiment among the professional scientific community. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and it's one thing that I have reflected on occasion, just because whenever creationists bring up religious arguments or they bring up religious concepts, well, we can't talk about that. I'm like, no, I think we can, because there's a dramatic skewing in religious profession among the scientific community versus the lay public. And don't tell me that doesn't play a role in how the scientists go about their daily work or how they interpret their conclusions. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That's not to say that this sort of religious bias blinds them, but I think we can't ignore it. That's one point I think that needs to be made. Secondly, the specific argument the professor was making is a classic sort of bait and switch or equivocation. So they love to use the term evolution to mean almost anything and everything, from just generic change. So, I've got gray in my beard. That's a change from, I'm 45 now, and I've been noticing these gray hairs more. Am I evolving? Well, I'm degenerating, for one. This is not going to get us some sort of more highly intelligent, higher evolved human. But technically, by the definition that the professor just gave, where the flu is evolving, well, it's changing. I'm changing, but that doesn't mean I'm going to become a new species or somehow we're going to get better as a result. What really the debate comes down to is what type of change is occurring, number one, and what's the magnitude of the change. So young Earth creation scientists would say, we're quite fine with change. We're quite fine with natural selection happening, which is just survival of the fittest to reproduce. That's basically the textbook definition I learned in biology 102. We had to put it on the test. What is the process of evolution? It's survival of the fittest to reproduce. And of course that happens. But does survival of the fittest to reproduce generate people from particles? Does it generate new humans from bacteria? And of course the answer is no. We know there's certain structures that cannot be evolved by this process of evolution. So that's the classic bait and switch. Yes, of course, every medical doctor is going to acknowledge that the flu evolves, but that process of evolution is not going to give you some sort of people from protoplasm over billions of years. There are certain structures that cannot be evolved by this process. And I mean, I have to hand it to the evolutionists. It's a very effective strategy, this sort of bait and switch, because it does pull the wool over a lot of people's eyes because it sounds plausible. Well, how do you deny basic facts of life? Well, you don't, but those basic facts of life are not the types of facts that evolutionists need to undergird and demonstrate the validity of their larger idea that all life goes back to a common ancestor.
Would it be akin to saying, well, when an acorn plant, when you plant an acorn, it becomes a tree, but it doesn't become a pine tree? Would that be an answer that can be given, that even though it might change and it might technically evolve to a tree or grow to a tree, just like a fetus, as it grows within the womb, it makes changes, and then as is born, and then we grow into an adult, and then eventually, you're right, start to kind of degenerate. But we don't change, we don't all of a sudden, start as a human in the womb and then come out as a puppy. So is there something, does that also seem to fit in that argument that they're trying to make, that even though it can mutate and change, it's still a flu virus? Yes. So I'd say the analogy to acorn is a good place to start to get the evolutionist. I think that the ultimate goal is, please clarify your terms, is I think that I'd say is my main target. If I'm engaging an evolutionist, or let's say I'm a student in class, and I had to think through these things too as a undergraduate in a secular college, University of Wisconsin Parkside. When do you raise your hand? What do you ask? How do you help fellow students think critically about what the guy is saying up front? And getting them to clarify their terms is a good step. And so, would you say that an acorn
becoming a tree is evolution. If they say yes, okay, that's kind of silly. They might say, oh, no. What I'm talking about is that, and thinking through the potential hypothetical counterargument, I'm saying that there has to be some sort of generation to generation change, and so there has to be reproduction of some sort. So if the acorn becomes an oak tree, which makes more of itself, maybe that could be a type of evolution. Or if the flu virus reproduces itself, that could be one of their counter arguments. Then step 2, of course, is what's the end result? What have we observed the flu becoming, as you've just mentioned? Is it becoming something else, or is it still the flu? Is it a better form of the flu, or is it some sort of degenerate version? And so many examples they've given, for example, let's say antibiotic resistance bacteria. Yes, there's quote-unquote an improvement in the bacteria. It can now resist certain antibiotics, but oftentimes the mechanism is by breaking certain biochemical structures within the bacterium, which of course, breaking things is not going to improve it. It's going to make it oftentimes less fit in the wild. So you take it out of this, let's say in the human body where it has to fight antibiotics that we're giving the patient. You put it back in the wild, now with its broken system, a broken system that avoids antibiotics better in this patient, but in the normal environment now it let's say can't metabolize as quickly as we'd say in the lab, the wild type version or the unmutated version. So in the end it probably in the wild gets selected away and get eliminated because it's actually less fit now than its competitors because it broke some system to make it antibiotic resistant. These are the sorts of questions I think that are critical for students to ask when they're in this sort of setting. What do you mean? And okay, what's the end goal? And they won't come up with an example. There are no examples of some sort of dramatic change. Yes, we've seen new species form. It actually, the example I'm thinking of actually confirms the predictions I've made for species in my book, Replacing Darwin. But where have we seen a cat become a dog? Where have we seen people become something else? We all recognize this intuitively, and the evolutionists will admit when you press them, show me an example of some sort of major change. Show me the example of, let's say, a new family forming, a cat becoming a dog, or a giraffe becoming a horse. They'll say, oh no, that's too big of a change. It has to take a long period of time, which of course is long beyond the human lifespan. That's a bit of a dirty little secret when it comes to evolution. The only types of changes that we've observed, the only evolution, so to speak, has been small changes. A classic term for that is microevolution. Yeah. And these are terms that are even used in the professional literature, microevolution, macroevolution, and again, you have to define them. But if you press an evolutionist, they will tend to admit, yes, we see microevolution, we tend not to see macroevolution, or they'll say, yes, we see it in the fossil record. But in terms of things that doctors observe, never been witnessed. And that's, of course, something they won't want to admit too much in public.
But even the fossil record that they reference, they don't show the in-between stages. You never see, a fish becomes a bird, but you never see anything that has both scales and feathers to do it. So there still seems to be gaps there. But I know that a lot of evolutionists will argue, and so in looking at like your books, for example, they would say that the genetic patterns and the biological complexity that you're talking about is only because you're just arguing God of the gaps. That all you're doing is you're just saying science. That just because science hasn't proved it yet, you're just now pointing to God. How do you respond to that? Because that is a very popular argument. I know Peter Atkins. I know he's very fond of that argument. And then there's many others. So how do you respond to that?
Yes, it's been a common argument, especially against the intelligent design community. I think Bill Dembski has developed a fairly sophisticated mathematical model to try to infer design. I think what that essentially comes back to, if I'm sort of hearing the background echo, the implied echo of this argument is, what they're saying is give us testable predictions. Don't just say, we're going to, the evolutionists are going to say to the creationist, okay, creationist, you can't just keep pointing out where we've come up short. You have to come up with arguments of your own. That's essentially another form of the argument, God of the gaps. You're just looking at what we're doing, all the effort we've put in, and then just saying, you're short here. But then we fill the gap, and then you point out another gap, and those are some of the same forms of the argument. And behind all that, ultimately, if you really press the evolutionist for what exactly do you want, if it's not a God of the gaps, they'll resort to, well, you need to give us testable predictions. You need to state your premises, state your hypotheses, and then tell us, for example, how you can go out and test this. So one big testable prediction I put in Replacing Darwin that I've seen come true is a fairly straightforward derivation of a plain reading of Scripture. So if you read Genesis 1 through 11, especially 6 through 9, you'll see that the Bible talks about a global flood. This is my reading of it. And that all of humanity is destroyed except for Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. So all of us go back to 8 people on board the ark. And that all pre-flood civilizations are destroyed. And everything we read about in history books, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and so on, Sumer in the Middle East, all these have to be post-flood civilizations. So that's step one of my derivation. All civilizations are post-flood. Well, the history of civilization is going to leave a stamp in our DNA. For example, there's been migrations from Central Asia into Europe. There have been migrations of Alexander the Great and his army through the Middle East. There's all sorts of records of this. And ultimately, especially if there's rape and pillage and slaughter and such, ugly things of facts of history, those leave an echo in our DNA. It's a technical point, but just to summarize, you can see it. Now, the evolutionists would agree with all that, but they would have a very different time scale. So they'd say humanity evolved in Africa 200,000 years ago, and the history of civilization doesn't begin until about 5,000 years ago. And a point I'm making here is a relative point. In terms of their time scale, relative terms, the history of civilization is way at the end. I have to look at my own camera here. So if we start here, it's way at the end. The very tip, the tail end of evolution is the history of civilization. So they almost wouldn't go looking in our DNA for the history of civilization, because if a family tree then represents time, and the deep part of the tree represents the beginning, and the tips of the branches represent the end. It's just the very tips of the branches where we might see some genetic echo. I'm getting into a technical point here, but the bigger picture is evolution almost doesn't expect to find the history of civilization in our DNA, because it's just a tiny fraction of the overall timescale. Whereas for me, as a young Earth creationist, the history of civilization is the entire post-flood history. I should see the echoes of the Roman Empire, of the Greek conquest, of the Middle Ages, and so on, of colonialism, all throughout our DNA, of the transatlantic slave trade. And that's really actually where I began with that question. And my book-length answer is, yes, we can find the history of civilization stamped throughout all of our DNA. And really, to get back to the bigger picture point, is I made a prediction in 2017. We should be able to find the history of DNA stamped, the history of civilization stamped all over our DNA. 5 years later, found the fulfillment of that. That's the type of thing the evolutionists have demanded. They don't really have an answer to it. I follow my critics to see what they're saying and criticizing these points, and they don't have an answer. And really, the answer that they have given is ironic. They've essentially said, I must be wrong because I disagree with the textbooks. They're almost behaving like the religious stereotype they accuse us of being. Apparently there's this holy book that you can't contradict the textbook, and its most literal interpreters are the ones who can guide us into ultimate truth. I mean, you can't make it up. Truth is stranger than fiction. And the very thing we've been accused of doing for 40 years, now the evolutionists are doing. Now that we've met this standard of testable predictions, it's no longer this God of the gaps idea. We've mocked them. That's really what the God of the gaps is their reaction to our mockery of their ideas, because it is foolish. Evolution is a foolish idea that tends to be the dominant one because they've excluded all competition. They've made that sort of mockery and God of the gaps thing effectively illegal, but we've now countered that and met the standard that they've demanded we meet, and there's no argument for it. There's just a total reversal of roles.
But they can't test their theory either, right? I mean, because evolution is not also a testable theory in a traditional sense, unless you're looking at it from some type of forensic analysis. But even then, because you can't test it empirically, because there's nothing there that's currently going on. If I'm thinking about this correctly, so the standard they're putting on you to answer God of the gaps, I don't think they can put on themselves to answer where theirs is coming from outside of some vague generalities of the jump from one species to the next that might look similar. Am I correct in that thinking?
I'd say yes, and there's in a sense two sides to this. I'll explain what I mean with a favorite example of mine that I read about in, I think it was Sean Carroll's book, Endless Forms Most Beautiful. He was talking about, I think the subtitle is The Science of Evo-Devo, or Evolutionary Developmental Biology. And of course, if you look in textbooks today, they'll say, one of the premier examples, evidences for evolution, is the fact that the genetic programs in fruit flies and mice and humans are shared. So if you look at the genes involved in building a fruit fly eye, and of course it's got this compound, complex eye that can see all sorts of things, and our eye, of course, is very different in terms of a morphological perspective. But if you look at the genes that the fruit fly uses, pieces of DNA to build the eye, you can find similar genetic programming in our DNA as well. Voila, evolution. See, common ancestry is their argument. What's ironic is, and this is actually in Sean Carroll's book, I can't believe he admitted this. He says, if you go back, I think, to the 50s, and one of the famous evolutionists, I don't remember if it's Ed E.O. Wilson or one of the other guys, but writing in the 50s, in the pre-DNA era, so just to give a timeline context, 1953 is Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, and if you look at the history of genetics, that was really one of the last planks to finally establish DNA as the substance of heredity, rather than protein. And protein was actually the popular idea before then. So this is how far back in time we're going. And Wilson, or one of these other guys, says, you know what? Before we even had DNA data, this is his prediction. So in a sense, you could say this is a testable prediction of evolution. You know, evolution's been going on for so long, species have been evolving for millions of years, and they've been diverging and changing their DNA for so long, it's going to be hopeless looking for any sort of shared DNA among species like fruit flies and mice and humans, as a hypothetical example, because there are too many millions of years separating their common ancestors, and so just forget it. It's not going to happen. And of course, Sean Carroll is telling the story, saying, well, we found the opposite, and it's great evidence for evolution. And here's the irony. So in one sense, yes, evolution should be testable because this evolutionist back in the 50s made a prediction. We then found the opposite of what he predicted, which should be the death knell for evolution. Instead, it's now textbook evidence for its veracity. So in a sense, evolution explains everything, which means it explains nothing, because you can bend and mold and twist and shape evolution to fit anything you want to after the fact, is apparently how it works. So in one sense, yes, it is testable because you can find predictions. But in practice, those predictions don't matter. You just adjust the theory to explain the opposite of what you predicted and then call it a win. So I wish I could play by those rules, because those are very friendly and ensure victory every time I try. But I'm not allowed to play by those rules, which is fine because it's ultimately irrational. There's no sensible basis to this. If you can make your idea flex and fit anything, you don't learn anything this way. When things can be disproven, that's how you actually make progress. That's how science is supposed to work. So I would say ultimately, practically, evolutionists have shown by their own behavior, no, you cannot test it because there's nothing that can disprove it. That's ultimately the standard of science. It comes from the philosophy of science that goes back, I think, a couple centuries. The hypothetical deductive method, you're supposed to be able to, in theory, disprove something. And evolutionists have shown there really is no standard by which you can disprove it. Michael Behe, again, took Darwin's own standard, showed that he could disprove it, and evolutionists have tried to marginalize him unsuccessfully time and time again. I mean, legally they have, but his ideas are still powerful, and you can't suppress that. So that's my observation about that point. It's a good point. They're erecting a standard that they themselves have shown they cannot meet. That doesn't stop them from still applying it to their opponents, nonetheless. But it's a worthy point to make.
Even Einstein, I don't know if a lot of people know this or not, but even Einstein intentionally falsified his data because it was going to show up somewhere, and it was something simple like divide by zero. And then even after it was called out and he corrected and admitted he did it, he still said this is the most frustrating or irritating, I think was the word he used, because it pointed to a creator, and he did not want to admit that at all. So we're at the end though, and I'd love to keep asking you questions about this because there's just so many different levels, especially when it comes to just even that one part of the genetic pieces of it. So, but most people I think they get so bogged down into Genesis because it seems so it's so supernatural, and so it seems foreign to them, and as a result of them, it's the easiest place I think for non-Christians to attack. So how do they find out more about the answers in Genesis? How do they find out more about your books? How do they find out more about a lot of this stuff so they can understand and be able to deal with this, particularly when our children are being institutionalized with the opposite?
Yes, good question. I'll give two answers. One is where to go, and then a story that maybe will function as a piece of advice to anyone trying to work through these issues, because it's near and dear to my heart, and I've seen, kind of witnessed firsthand the struggle of how do I change my thinking and the trauma of it. So our homepage, answersongenesis.org, is a great place to start. Thousands of articles. There's a web store. I publish a number of books, again, for various audiences, replacing Darwin, especially for folks who've been thoroughly indoctrinated in evolution and, okay, walk me how you reach your, step-by-step through how you reach your conclusions. Replacing Darwin made simple for Cliff Notes version, again, for people who say, I agree with you, but I just don't know how to counter these points. That's practical advice. And really, I should say, too, we're at the stage now where creation science, in a sense, has come full circle. We've spent so many decades reacting to evolutionary headlines and hold on, wait, not so fast, and here's the problems with it. We've been able to make progress, make predictions, fulfill them. We're now breaking news, and roles are being reversed, where, hey, we've just found a discovery that no one has the answer to before, and the evolutionists are going to come in and say, well, hold on, not so fast. They're going to do to us the same things we've been doing to them for 40 years. So Answers in Genesis is a one-stop place to go to find a lot of that. We do have 2 attractions that are, in a sense, designed to train people in thinking. So the Creation Museum here in northern Kentucky, just outside Cincinnati, is, in a sense, a walk through history through the lens of the Bible. Creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion. We got the 7 C's acronym, that's 4 of them, to help people sort of begin to think biblically. That's been Ken Ham's passion for decades, is teaching the church to be able to apply the biblical worldview to these questions and to work through the common skeptical questions like, well, where did Cain get his wife? How do you fit animals on board the ark? There's lots of things that can intimidate people real fast, but there's great answers. So that's, anyway, I could go on for a long time, but that's a great place to spend hours just exploring. There's tons of free stuff on our website too. Articles, books that are made available for free. But here's the story that I come back to a lot. I was giving a lecture at a small junior college in Texas. This is when I was with ICR over 10 years ago. And I feel like this is, I hope anyone who's struggling with this issue, I think this will resonate with them. I gave a 45-minute lecture on dinosaurs. It's essentially a worldview talk. Dinosaurs are a great tool to help people sort of unlearn what they've been taught in the public schools and then relearn to think biblically. And I had a student, I don't know if he's a freshman or sophomore, come up to me, visibly, obviously distraught. He's like, this contradicts everything I've learned in the public schools. And he's a professing Christian, but it was plainly apparent that hearing all this and seeing such a tremendous dissonance with what he'd been taught was very difficult for him to process in 1 hour. I said, don't try to do that. You could see he was seeing the need to kind of do a brain transplant, to take out everything that had been learned and put in something new, and that's just, of course, brain transplants are traumatic. And I said, don't try to do that all at once. I said, you need to work through this slowly. There's years of what you've been taught that you're trying to unlearn in 60 minutes. You're not going to be able to do it in 1 hour. Just take your time. Don't feel so overwhelmed trying to do it all at once. Take your time working through these issues question by question, whether, let's say, it's carbon-14 dating. That might be one question. Spend time working on that. And work your way through, okay, what are the assumptions? Learn to think biblically on that one issue. Don't worry about the rest of the questions. Then work your way to the next question, because trying to take it all at once, anyway, again, I grew up in a Christian home, in a creationist home, and so I didn't have to go through the trauma of, I learned one thing and then had to unlearn it and learn something new, but I could see just how challenging it was. And again, my advice to him was, don't try to do it all at once. It's going to be rough. So take it slowly, patiently, and I think that's going to be much more productive and fruitful in the end. It's going to be worth it, of course, but don't feel like it has to happen all at once, because doing so is going to be a very rough sledding, and I don't wish that on anyone.
I agree completely. And to mirror my life, I used to use evolution. When I wasn't a Christian, I used to use evolution to attack Christians. And then when I became a Christian, I realized I had to deal with this issue. And it was like, okay, let's look at the 7 days first. Let's look at this idea of whether or not Darwin is correct. I mean, so I did. You break it down into piecemeal, because you're absolutely correct. To do it too much is overwhelming, and then I don't want to do it at all. So I appreciate that answer. So again, I appreciate you being on the show. To again find out more, you said it's answersingenesis.org. Is
Correct.
That right? Okay, cool. We'll have that in the show notes as well. And I appreciate work you're doing. I think it's absolutely awesome. I think it's absolutely incredible. And it's important that not just to point people to God and teach them that, but also to let people know that the science actually reflects something different they're being taught, that the education system is actually teaching them bad science.
Yes.
They can draw their own conclusions from the science they have. But I think it's important that we do that. And so I thank you so much for the work you're doing on all of it. And again, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Peter.
All right. Well, God bless you, and you have a great day.